Okay, this meeting is being recorded. This is a lecture on nationalism, sectionalism, and the market revolution. I expect it'll go about 13 minutes or so. Well, an overview of the lecture will talk about the early 19th century was a time of nationalism. We'll talk about sectionalism as an alternate strain of thought. We'll talk about how they combined during the market revolution to create modern America. And we'll end with thinking about what elements of American nationalism of the antebellum period remain part of our heritage. Well, one of the things that is part of our heritage is the Star-Spangled Banner, this flag that flew above Fort McHenry in 1814, and the lawyer Francis Scott Key wrote a poem that became very popular at the time. So one of the things we have to say about the antebellum era is that it's an era of increasing nationalism. However you want to date this era, from 1800 to 1860, from 1820 to 1860, from 1815 until 1848, all of that doesn't matter. It's all the pre-war era, the before the war era that we're talking about. One of the things that made the era was the publication of the first dictionary of the American language by Noah Webster. There's a recognition that we speak a different language than English people do, and that was part of American nationalism. The Washington biography by Parson Weems in 1804 told the story of Washington cutting down the cherry tree and honestly telling his father that he had done it. Well, this was hokum. It was completely made up. It was a false story, but it's part of that tendency of Americans to make our leaders into perfect figures, into gods, more or less. The War of 1812 was called the Second War for Independence. And while we did not defeat the English army, we survived the war. We fought them to a draw, more or less, and therefore we convinced ourselves that we won the war, especially with the final battle, the Battle of New Orleans, being a huge American victory that kind of sealed the deal for Americans, and it was a patriotic war of independence from the British that Americans had. There's the Star-Spangled Banner as it currently appears in the Smithsonian Institution that was written during the War of 1812. The legacy of the founders and the conceit that people can form a government that in which they prove that they can rule themselves is pretty much understood to be the legacy of the founders, that the Americans had been dealt a pretty good hand of cards and they just needed to play them well. And there was that sense of American expansion, of American progress inherent in the system. Americans looked upon themselves as standing for something, as standing for freedom or independence or capitalism or something that's uniquely political. And I think that brand of American nationalism lasts into the present day, that it's uniquely political in nature. So the sectionalism, the increasing identity with one's section of the country, seems in conflict with nationalism, but they really are a matter of going forward with this idea that as nationalism increases, your economic identity as part of a region takes root. The market revolution that we associate with 1815 to 1848 is to a great extent a product of the regional specialization, each region doing what it does best, and the transportation revolution that went along with it. So the transportation revolution, the building of steamships, building of turnpikes, building of canals, and then railroads, all of the transportation revolution allowed for there to be regional specialization, and that disrupted the subsistence patterns of behavior that had been in place for many generations. Most Americans own their own farm. That's an important fact of life. And those subsistence patterns were based upon tradition, face-to-face encounters, no banks, barter economy of trading goods for goods. Those kinds of subsistence patterns where interest was not charged on many items turned into market behaviors that were based upon the behavior of the 1700s and 1800s, that where the price for a peach was set in London or New York and not by our face-to-face agreement. So the market behaviors entered into the day-to-day life of Americans, and banks were invented and became more common as paper money began to make its way into common usage. That resulted in booms and busts of the time, and banks were considered very much a function of workers by banks that could be state or local banks. The merchant books of merchants in Chillicothe, Ohio, the town that I went to do my doctoral research, reflect the fact that early in the century, everything was barter. Goods for goods were traded. But by the 1850s, it was a matter of cash for goods, goods for cash. And that was reflected in the merchant books of the middle of the century. So the last thing I would say is that Americans either embraced the market revolution or feared its consequences in their lives. Many Americans looked to this as a good thing, as something that could lead to economic progress. But many Americans feared the consequences of the market revolution and feared its long-term impact for American independence and history. Okay, that's it for this lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. Stop and goodbye.